So welcome everyone to our fourth Playlist for Learning Grantee webinar. It's produced on behalf of the 6th Digital Media and Learning Competition, which is administered by Haystack with support from the MacArthur Foundation. It's our Playlist for Learning competition, and I'm Cheryl Grant. I'm Director of Social Networking for the DML competition, and I will be your host for the next hour. Before I introduce our special guest, I want to let people know how you can participate and ask questions for this webinar. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, and I'll toss those to Gurley as she goes through her presentation and slides. And for those of you who have attended our orientation webinar leading up to the competition, you may remember Gurley Dela Cruz, who is Senior Research Associate at LRNG. In her previous work, she worked at UCLA Crest, and I am going to cheat over here and read a little bit of Gurley's bio on her LRNG, just to give you an idea of how much expertise she's bringing to this. I think we're very fortunate. Over 14 years of research experience in the areas of cognitive science, developmental psychology, assessment, and learning. Applied research, also focusing on the design and use of various forms of technology, including computers, video games, mobile devices, and sensor-based networks to understand and measure learning and performance in both educational and military contexts. So, Gurley, I'm going to toss over to you, and if you want to get started, we are all ready and settled in.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that intro. Cheryl had asked me to put together a set of slides for you all to give you just a brief overview about about what assessment is and how we're approaching it at LRNG. And as Cheryl mentioned, feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm happy to stop. And I'll just get going. As I share my screen. Okay. So what is assessment? My goal in my professional life is to help people really understand that assessment is not just tests. It's not just high stakes standardized testing, and it's not just summative information. In fact, I love using this quote. It's a quote from the book, Knowing What Students Know. And I think it really captures all the different dimensions of assessment. That assessment is a process of reasoning from evidence, using tools designed to observe students' behavior and produce data that can be used to draw reasonable inferences about what students know. So the key take-home message behind this is that I look at assessment as a generation tool and a generation process. It will generate information about students, data, evidence, knowledge, and a whole host of different other things depending on how you design it. So how do we go about designing assessment? We go through a process of backward planning through evidence-centered design. Evidence-centered design is an approach started by Bob Mislevy out of University of Maryland, although he's now at ETS. And it's an approach to designing assessment where you think of where you specify your learning goals up front at a degree of specificity that actually helps you design the task. And I'm going to step you through what that actually looks like. So as I said, the very first step is you specify your learning goals, and that is the concept, skill, or big idea that is to be learned by youth when they complete the playlist. A guiding question that we use in thinking about this is, what is it that we want our youth, what is it that we want youth to have learned or be able to do after completing these playlists? And then that leads you to defining the evidence needed for you to know that your learning goals have been met. And we suggest that this description is something measurable and observable. So and I'll go through it I'll go through an actual example moving forward. So to help give you context for how to do this. But the guiding question for defining your success criteria or behavioral objective is, how do I know? How do I know that my learning goal has been met? And then finally, the next, you design the assessment activity. And part of the design aspect of it, part of the design is describing the characteristics or features of the activity that will actually elicit the behavior that you want to evaluate. And the behavior, again, comes from your description in step 2. You also want to consider where and how are you conducting your assessment. Is it something that you expect to, what kind of tools and materials do you expect your students, your youths to be working with as they engage in the assessment activity? Are there time constraints if you are designing something that's supposed to mimic something they're going to do in real life? Thinking about all of that will help you come up with the characteristics of the task and help you begin the design process. And then finally, one of the things that I have learned in my years of doing this is that specifying the scoring rules up front really helps in the actual design of the assessment, because oftentimes we go through designing a task, and once we start actually generating a rubric or thinking about how we're going to score it, we realize that perhaps the instructions need more information, or that that maybe what we're asking youths to do isn't really reflective of the kind of quality we want to see. So the guiding question for this is, what do I actually need to see to establish that, to establish and determine the quality of youth performance? So an example I'm going to talk you through is from one of our Best Buy playlists for designing e-textiles. And our learning goal for this is that after completing this playlist, our youth would have been able to apply knowledge of the elements and principles of design and have basic hand sewing skills for electronic circuits that they will sew onto fabric. So this learning goal, we realized, it led to the behavioral objective that we actually want to see kids create the e-cuff, and that the e-cuff would incorporate at least one element and one principle of designing the e-textile. So because the learning goal was that we were expecting youth to actually apply their knowledge, this meant that the success criteria or the behavioral objective that we specified required them to actually do something, perform something, and in this case, to actually create a product. If perhaps a learning goal was for that youth, could understand the basic facts about circuitry, our success criteria or behavioral objective might have been something different. And in fact, we have a playlist in which this learning goal was that, and the objective for that was for them to actually demonstrate declarative knowledge of circuit concepts. So you can see how, depending on your learning goal, what the behavioral objective looks very different. With the assessment activity, we had to design something in which youth would have access to e-textile tools. We specified the types of fabric that we wanted them to use, the number of LEDs we wanted them to be able to light up, the materials that they would use, whether it was an alligator clip versus a snap switch. And we also specified whether that at some point we wanted to observe youth completing the task both with assistance and on their own, so that we can tell that they've achieved mastery without adult or peer help. And finally, with our scoring rules, based on our task characteristics and our task specifications that we listed in the design of our assessment activity, we on our rubric, we noted that their e-cuff should actually include a series circuit with alligator clips and a snap switch to successfully light up to 3 LEDs in some graphical design. So this was an example to show how starting off with your learning goal sort of steps you through all the different steps along the way of backward planning. all the way down to the scoring rules. I mean, I do want to say that with the scoring rules, when we realized, one of the things that had us, when we went through the scoring rule process, we had to revise the actual instructions in the assessment activity to have these requirements specifically laid out so that youths actually knew the requirements. And so it made the assessment task much more explicit and descriptive for youths, and then they were able to understand what the criteria and what the requirements were, and the expectations of the task that we were hoping for them.
So, Carly, can I just clarify something about that?
Yes.
So this is a whole playlist, and I'm guessing multiple XPs.
Yes.
And the assessment activity is happening as sort of but by showing that you've done this, it's like I think Seth Corrigan had referred to it in our face-to-face workshop meeting as did it, didn't do it. Is that right? So that the rules are, if you did it, then you are then done with the assessment activity. Is that right?
Part of it, yes. They would have to create the ECUF, but we do have a scoring rubric, and the ECUF had to have these elements in there. It had to have a series circuit. The series circuit had to use both the alligator clips and the snap switch to actually light up at least one and up to 3 LEDs.
Okay.
So there were bullet points that we communicated to the youth in terms of the requirements that had to be met. So
okay.
There was some sort of judgment that had to be made by a human score. It wasn't just, it was completed or not completed.
And then once that human had judged that they had met the criteria for the assessment, then the next thing was?
Then they, in this case, because this was the capstone XP, it was the last XP of the playlist, then the badge was awarded to them.
Okay.
So I will say what the human scores did not do was judge the aesthetic quality of the design, or the colors, the quality of it. That wasn't judged, because that wasn't part of the requirements. We just wanted to know and see if kids were actually able to execute these skills and actually do these things.
And then when they're going through the assessment activity, I guess it sounds like the one thing that's very specific about this experience is that there is a human involved. I'm just curious if you were doing this online only, if there would be something that recommends how to go back, or do you just recommend that they go back to earlier XPs until they can troubleshoot? Does that make sense?
Right. Well, it depends. Actually, so in this particular playlist, all of the preceding XPs sort of broke down this final project. So that could be one way to go back and help guide or provide feedback for youths to help them figure out where they went wrong. So it's possible, if you have a series of XPs that sort of build upon each other, and each task also builds upon each other to culminate in a final project the way this did.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll go into, I have a few practical tips, and I'll go into also some of the different levels of rigor that we use depending upon the nature of our playlist. And this might also address that question as well.
Great.
And I'm happy, and that's my next section. So I'm happy to pause here and see if anybody else has any questions in the meantime.
And I guess I do have another question. It's easier for me because I've read over everybody's proposals, and I know some people are not here. And I also had a chance to kind of eavesdrop on other conversations. So I'm channeling a little bit of that. But another question I have for you is, when you have been working with partners on assessment, or LMG has been working on these, do you see that people have a tendency to put in too many assessments or not enough assessments, or is having an assessment per each XP recommended or not recommended, or does it just depend on the activity?
Well, right now, the way the system is designed, we require that each XP has results in a youth submitting something. whether or not it's a piece of text that reflects, that has the youth reflect upon their experience, or actually produce some sort of artifact, or take a screenshot. That's the design at this point. We are talking about having a set of playlists and having functionality where the XPs would just be purely experiential and may not require any sort of assessment at all.
It's looking pretty likely, Girly, that will be built into the embedded resources feature, where the show improved block will actually be optional.
Exactly.
So you have the ability to click it off and then not require a potential each individual XP to actually have proof attached.
That's right, right. And one of the things also that we are hoping to have, at least possibly in 2017, but definitely by 2018, is having a way for peers to be or the youths actually to be able to request feedback, especially if in this case the show improves are optional. If they want and the peers could, youths can either ask for feedback from a mentor, or they can even ask for feedback from peers alone. So, but to answer your first question, the first part of your question, which is what sort of problems have we encountered? I think the biggest hurdle, or at least I think it's the scoring part. The not specifying the scoring rules right away, and so usually once I start probing about, well, how, what with this task, what would good quality, what would a successful completion of this task actually look like, then the wheels start turning, and then all of a sudden you start seeing the iteration that was needed. And it, of course, it happens, you do you take your first draft, and once you start actually thinking about that, then the assessment becomes clearer to our designers and us ourselves, as evaluating it, whether or not it actually aligns with the learning goals of that XP.
So just to confirm what you just said, does that mean not only do they need to articulate the scoring rules to themselves early, but they have to also put those scoring rules into the XP early?
So there's definitely a debate between about whether or not the scoring rules should be communicated to youth. I definitely feel like I am of the camp that says that it should. I'm all about transparency, or at least but with the caveat that the rubric or scoring rules are communicated in a way that that youths that it should be able to guide the production of something, not just dictate, the right answers, right? But for most of the performance assessments that are going to be the kind that we'll be having in our LRNG playlist, there aren't any. It's not the scoring rules are not typically answer keys anyhow. So the rubrics, for me, if they're communicated to youths early on, then that it just communicates the expectations up front, as opposed to having youths try to guess what's expected of them, and then have the assessor evaluate and then give them feedback, and then goes through that loop, bypass that first hurdle by if you communicate the scoring rubrics up front, then that bypasses that hurdle of the guesswork that you just have to go through to figure out what's needed and what's expected of them.
That makes sense. We do have a question from Paul, and I know Kylie made a first foray into answering it and then asked for an example. So I'm just going to ask Paul to unmute, and you can ask your question, and if you feel comfortable doing that, and then and provide an example.
Yeah,
Hi,
I guess.
Paul.
Hi there. So I was just going the other way. It was mentioned that it would be possible to not have evidence put up, but we often struggle with needing more than one piece of evidence put up for an XP.
Right. That is a feature we are building in. I believe that should. Kylie, do you remember? Is that coming? It will definitely be in place before the summer. because we know that's absolutely critical. So
I just actually wrote that I was encouraging him to separate those out into different XPs instead of like asking teens for multiple things within the same XP. So like uploading, but I can see what you're saying. Like, so if the example is you wanted to upload like a video and then a text that said, hey, this is what I learned from doing my video,
Right.
for example. Yeah, that makes sense. But I was thinking of two separate learning goals within one XP. So that was my original response. And then I realized that might not be what Paul was actually asking about.
It's a good, yeah, I hear that. It's a good discipline. but sometimes, you know, you want more evidence of, you know, I've read this, here are my annotations for it.
Right.
And here's my response to it too.
Right. Yeah. So for those sort of XPs where, you know, I've produced something and here's my reflection or annotation of it, that's the feature that will be delivered before the summer. But I agree with Kylie that if there are two different learning goals with two different pieces of evidence, ideally they would be broken out.
Cool, thanks.
No problem. So should I go ahead, move forward with my set of practical tips?
Yes. Yeah, these are great.
Okay. So number one, I know one of our biggest pain points is actually having the time or the people or the expertise to do the assessment. So one of the things that our partners have been doing is if you don't have in-house people to do the assessment, possibly partnering with a local teacher or a local adult or mentor, somebody that might have the expertise and bandwidth to do the assessment for you. You know, I will say a lot of the artifacts that have been coming through don't require such heavy scoring or heavy lifting. So it may, you know, the scoring of each of them may take at most 5 to 10 minutes. Of course, it depends on your scale, but I think that's one of the asks that you could consider of your community. Also, we know that some of the organizations are partnering together to co-develop the playlists so that they can actually share the scoring work. That's also an option. And I would love to hear from you guys different ways you guys are exploring or dealing with this resource issue. Actually, I'd like to pause there and find out, because that's something we're very interested in different ways of doing this. And I guess I'm turning it back to the group and seeing if there's anything that you guys have been considering. I see Paul unmuted. Does that mean Paul has a suggestion?
I guess it's eye contact, right?
Yes. And exactly.
One of the things that we've been exploring, it's maybe trying to deal with two different issues. One is finding opportunities at the end of a badge, right, is not easy. And one of the things that many of us have come up with on the Youth Voices side of things is making young people into mentors for each other.
Yes.
So having different levels of peers, and then having those peers be able to assess each other's badges is one of the things that we're looking into.
That's perfect. Yeah.
I mean, we've done that with P2PU and so forth. So some model like that where once you receive the badge, you then become kind of responsible and able to approve other people's badges within that.
That's right. That's definitely a model that we're encouraging. I thank you for reminding me. I need to add that to this bullet. But having peers start to be the assessors, especially once they've earned the badge, I think that's a great practice, and one that's actually scalable. So that's a perfect one.
Yeah, just to say the downside of that is to say to somebody who's finished a badge, oh, now you have more work to do.
That's true.
We're thinking about that. So.
And we have heard research here, and this might be at the higher ed level, but I would be curious if this is the same with youth, that peer can actually be a much more demanding assessor than a teacher.
That's interesting. Right.
We do have some other questions. We have a comment here from Edgar. He's saying that they are hoping to leverage mentors and professionals. So it sounds like your idea is probably for some people just out of necessity is to reach out to partners. And then Joan is saying in terms of sharing their work with Sci Girls Code. Yeah, Joan, do you want to come out and say your comment, or would you like me to?
Oh yeah, no, that's fine. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Joan. Good to see you again, or good to see your face. I mean, your little box.
Hi, Curly. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge here today. Yeah, we are planning that, the girls will be doing capstone at the end of each of the different projects we'll be doing, the different areas. And we plan to give the educators very high level rubrics, so we're not going to be too much in their business, but some just general guidance where they can give feedback to the girls, which would likely happen face to face. But I like the idea, we also are having mentors, both digital mentors and encouraging people to find mentors in their own communities. So that's a nice aspect, because that can be great to get, real feedback from practitioners is a good idea. And we also will we haven't talked about it to date, but they will be sharing their work across communities. So that's another idea, to have peer assessment.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Should I go ahead and move on?
So I think we got everybody's questions.
Perfect. So getting started, I had shared these slides internally, and one of the questions somebody had asked me was, any feedback about how to just get up and going. And my response was, just start building, start designing, start creating, and get feedback right away. And these could even just be rough draft descriptions of your ideas. That plus the checking in and actually testing out the assessment activity with youth, and really looking at these core set of questions. How are they approaching it? Maybe have them talk aloud what they're doing. This will help you see whether or not your design is actually executing in the way you're hoping it would. And in particular, are they using different skills or knowledge that you weren't anticipating being required of doing the task? That's also a good practice and a helpful exercise for us to engage in. And finally, this is something I sort of almost, something new to our way of thinking about this, but we have sort of reformulating the way we're thinking about our playlist content, but doing so thinking about both the level of rigor that's needed, thinking about the level of rigor that's needed in terms of the assessment. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll have a set of playlists or XPs actually that are just purely exploration or participation based. And so as Kylie mentioned in the embedded resource feature, it'd be purely for consumption, and youths would not be required to submit or prove something. And then there's also the complete or incomplete that Cheryl was alluding to. And this is where you would just be looking to see that a youth has done something, and no quality judgment would be required at all, other than to perhaps make sure that what was submitted was not just, a bunch of random letters or a random image if you asked for an image that was uploaded, but it was purely just did they complete the task or not complete the task. For playlists or XPs where the scope is really just to get their get their initial skill development started in content in the interest area, then we start to think about assessment as requiring a very low level of rigor. And the rule of thumb I use for that is that with the rubric, really no content expertise is needed to judge whether criteria have been met. So for instance, I would say, I'm trying to think of a good example. We have one for the Voto for Voto Latino, we have a playlist, we have an XP where we ask youths to identify an issue and identify a potential a civic way they would solve or address that issue. And the scoring rules is just that those two things exist in their written reflection. An issue has been identified, and they've said whether they're going to, engage social media or write a letter to a politician. And so you don't really need to have deep content expertise to judge the quality of it. You're just looking to see, does this product have this certain level of criteria? That's fine. Yes. So then it's been met, it's checked, and we can mark that as the criteria having been completed. So that's for low level types of assessment. Now, with a medium level assessment, this is where the rubric would require some. It would have a rubric, and it should be scored by at least one scorer. And this may require some quality judgment. Again, you don't necessarily have to be an expert. That's for the medium to high level when you're starting to really develop expertise in a content area. So in the case of the Best Buy e-textile playlist, once we start caring about the aesthetic aspects of the design, for instance, I know I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable actually judging that. I would want to bring somebody who actually has a design background to start to doing that score. But of course, that's when also you got the scope of your playlist is your youths are actually developing their expertise in that area. And then finally, when you get into the high level, high stakes, that's the kind of assessment where that's needing high stakes testing, where you may have iterator reliability. These are for playlists. I don't think from what I remember, none of you have any of these, but this is where you are doing something that's unlocking like a course credit or an academic employment, an employment job, something where the opportunity is very high stakes, in which case the quality judgment will be high, and you need to have a high degree of credibility and rigor behind that. So any questions about this slide in particular? Because I know there's a lot to digest.
Feel free to chime in, Paul.
Yeah, I was trying to find my mute. So I don't know if it's a different dimension or something, but as you were speaking, I was thinking it would be different whether or not the student is doing a self-assessment of their work. So I'm just wondering if some of these qualities change when there's a self-assessment added to it. And I'm trying to think of an example. I know yeah, go ahead.
With the self-assessment, I guess in this case, a youth's ability to engage in self-assessment would increase also, right? So instead of, I guess, if we look at the right-hand column where it says scope of playlist content, if we're flipping this and adding it to the self-assessment, I would maybe frame it as expertise, right? So, that initial exploration, youth it's just, do I do it? Do I not do it? Do I care? And then as I go on, not both, I would say how I start to evaluate my work sort of increases both in level of rigor and ability, right? As I develop expertise and that ability to, start to evaluate and judge the quality of my work. I don't know, that's my initial gut reaction, but I'm curious what your thoughts are as well.
I'm thinking, I don't know. It just seemed that it would be hard to look at an artifact and go through that scope necessarily. But if there was a self-assessment, I would be able to do it. If you want to know if it's an area of interest, you say, is this an area of interest? And you see what they answer.
I see.
I'll think about it.
Well, one of the things I know we've done also in the past, and is to we have had youth sort of judge their confidence about the like whether or not what they've done is correct or incorrect or meets standards or meets the requirements. And what I have seen when we did this over at Crest is that it actually tended to correlate with the actual scoring pretty highly. So it was, I think what you're getting at, or at least how I'm interpreting or wanting to interpret what you're getting at, is that youths are pretty perceptive about what they know and don't know. And asking them to do that sort of also brings up that metacognition, that self-awareness of, is this something really that I feel confident about? Or, yeah, I did it, but I'm not really sure it meets, I'm meeting the criteria, or that I don't really know if I got the answer right or wrong, so.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
I have a slightly different, I want to look at this from a slightly different perspective, I guess. The same thing with rigor, but from the person who's evaluating the badge.
Right.
And so I was looking at some of the badges on, I guess it's, I think it's the Pittsburgh site. And I'm looking at the Best Buy one just to stay consistent with your example. And I'm curious if, and maybe this is a question for other people who are on the call just as much as with you, Girly, or Kylie as well. So the criteria for the badge, and maybe this is different than what a person would see. Maybe this is just the sort of the generic criteria, but I'm just thinking about rigor as the person who, for lack of a better word, is consuming the badge or viewing the badge. If there's any recommendation to convey the rigor, this is how this person was assessed based on the criteria. Yeah.
I'm glad, interesting you asked that question. That's definitely a conversation that we've been having internally, whether we make available also the scoring rubrics or the scoring requirements actually baked into the badge, so that so that badge consumers can actually see not only the criteria, but how they were assessed. So that functionality is being considered. I don't know if that addresses your question, but go ahead.
I sort of feel that this is going to be a thing we gather data about, and then I figure it out. Like it might be too hard to figure out on a one-off basis because we need employers or people who are viewing the badge to give us feedback about. Right. It does seem like right from the very beginning with badges, it felt like people are asking more of badges than they would say of every other kind of assessment. So people do not interrogate grades in the same way that they interrogate badges. And it's sort of like for the first time they're beginning to think about assessment just because they are being presented with a credential that they're unfamiliar with. So I'm just curious if in this realm, it seems like people can think about that. And I noticed this with some of our grantees will say that they're going to align their assessment with certain standards, national standards. And I sort of have this, I've said this before to other people who will listen to let me talk about this, that I think of it as a cylinder, like we're trying to add as much content that builds up to trust.
Right.
And so sometimes aligning with standards is adding a little bit of trust, and then having relationships with the badge viewer and the people issuing is another little chunk of it. And then rigorous assessment is another chunk, depending on what people are going for. But I guess I was curious about anything that might be grabbing, and if anybody else on the call has insights into this, I'd be curious to hear about it.
So let me tell you about two examples that one that already happened, and one that we are actually starting work on for 2017. So what West Sacramento did really well in establishing this really strong link between their badges their assessment of it, and then the actual opportunity or unlock that are associated with the badge is so they developed a set of badges, and the opportunity unlock is that if whoever earns this badge is supposed to be invited to interview for an internship for a city job. And because the opportunity was that an actual interview for a city job, what they did was they sat down with all of the hiring managers and division heads and said, what do you actually, with this badge, what do you need to see for you to accept the badge as being credible and valuable, or for you to accept the badge as being representative of somebody you may want to hire, right? And think about this in terms of if a youth was going to give you a binder, what in this binder do you need to see? And they hashed through this, and they said it took about 2 or 3 hours. But after that, when they specified all the different pieces that needed to go in the binder, those pieces actually ended up becoming their XPs, right? So it was what they did so successfully was they forced the buy-in and forced the acceptance to happen way up front, right? And then that happened before any design occurred at all. And so we're doing something similar with GAP right now. We are going to work with the GAP and we'll work with their hiring managers, their HR department, and and then their store managers to talk about, what sort of competencies do you really want to see for entry-level employees? And then we're going to design the capstone XPs based on those competencies, and then after that, and then the actual badges. And then the next phase of work is the playlist. So you notice there, in that case, we didn't start with the playlist at all. We are starting with, for 8 months, actually really developing this high stakes, very rigorous and accepted set of badges linked to these capstone XPs that the GAP personnel are going to endorse and stamp and have their stamp of approval, right? And then what we're also going to do is have youths go through them and have those same managers evaluate those XPs to see, is it really yielding the kind of evidence that we need and we want, or that we will actually trust, as you're saying, right? For these badges. So, that's one of the approaches I think we can use or leverage in building that trust and building that rigor. But I'm, like you, eager to hear other suggestions or other approaches that the community is exploring in addressing this.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking as I was reading the criteria is I am assessing the assessment.
Right.
I may also feel, just like a youth might give you different feedback about going through the activity, I may feel as an assessor, I'm just using myself as an example, that I need more information about what this means. And so that's the data that we really don't yet have. So this would be good for grantees to think about, that you'll have a lot of control over what you add. I don't think there really are any answers about it. I think the tighter the relationship is throughout the whole string, probably the less you need to convey that. But if it's going to be a very diffuse audience of people who are going to be viewing the badge, there could be a higher bar for, I really don't know what this means in terms of how much help they got or how much they did on their own, or, unfortunately people are going to think that way. Or maybe naturally people are going to think that way. I thank you for answering that. I'm so curious about how people are looking at badges, what they're thinking about them. I see Gina has asked a question, and I'm guessing, Gina, if you want to come out and ask it directly, that's fine. Or if you want me to ask it, either way, give you a chance to see if you can unmute here. It's a very simple question, so I'll just ask it. Oh, Gina, okay, there you are. Okay.
Yes. How about sharing?
Yes.
I just saw I'm able to finally see the chat now. So I just saw the
No worries. I was just wondering around
Yes.
providing students with exemplars. So
That's-
instead of them guessing and trying to figure out what's expected of them, both for the assessors and for the students, showing them high quality work. So
Exactly.
what does an exemplar look like?
Yeah, that is, we are, right now there's sort of a Kluge workaround to be able to do that with the resource field, but it is a feature that I believe, and again, yeah, Kylie, confirm from your recollection and understanding, but I believe the ability to put in exemplars should be delivered definitely before summer.
Okay.
And have it actually be a special field so that it's called out to the youth that this is an exemplar, or here's a rubric here, or here's an example of what we need or what we want to see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I could see it being part of the embedded resources build, actually, where we just had a different block that's literally like
Exactly.
upload an exemplar of the work.
That's right. Exactly. But we're just trying to, the design folks are definitely trying to figure out how to communicate it explicitly to youths, but that functionality is, I'm pushing for it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Paul, did you want to go ahead and
That's a good one. Mm-hmm.
share your comment?
So I'm working on a project with the Educational Video Center, and we're trying to figure out pathways to get kids credit for the video production they're doing. And when we go to the colleges, they say, "Oh, you're doing Photoshop. Here are the things they need to learn in Photoshop," right? So and we have other kinds of political goals and commitment stuff and personal storytelling that we're after also. So my point is merely that the people who are receiving the badges don't necessarily have the same goals as we do.
Mm-hmm.
So it can go back and forth a little bit. I mean, just to say, that's what we're finding. I mean, we don't have to necessarily accept what the partners are saying are the goals for the program. So.
That's right.
So I'm guessing for people who are not asking any questions, you all have your assessment all figured out. This is a good comment from Edgar. Part of that is finding common ground between stakeholders, having the right partners.
One of the things I like about Playlist is you can have a narrative thread that ties together some of these bigger goals that you might have as a learning institution that also helps you build the skills that they need. So the creating of multiple entry points that somehow combine the skills that these other stakeholders might be really after with your larger goals as a learning institution that might be based around social justice or, political involvement, political awareness. I think those things can really live nicely together. And we work a lot with corporate social responsibility officers. And so that gives us a little more leverage when we're trying to promote some of the equity and social justice goals that we have as an organization too.
So one other question that I had when I was looking at the different types of assessment that grantees have shared in their proposals, and a couple of them make reference to needing to build a tool or build, and by tool, like a self-assessment mechanism or scoring rules or anything like that. Is there any kind of shared resource that might help people take a look at how others are using those prompts, if that's what it is, or if there's different, I guess I'm thinking about, Gurley, about your framework with all the levels of rigor. Is there a way that grantees or some resource out there that grantees could have access to that would help them realize, okay, well, this kind of self-assessment is very rigorous versus this, which is less so? Or do you recommend that people just sort of do it intuitively and user test with their teens or youth?
The answer, I would say, is actually both. So we are putting together a set of tools. We have templates to for how to design the capstone XPs, for instance. Make these frameworks and the ECD process. Also have templates for that as well. But I also definitely encourage the user testing and the checking and the iteration. I think the tools help in that initial design process, and maybe as a self-evaluative guide as you go through it. But ultimately, until you actually get it out there, get your hands dirty in the task, you never really know, right? So,
yeah, we do have some grantees who are coming from very strong content expertise in an area,
right.
and they're moving into a learning environment, and they do have people around them. And I feel the same way about my own role, that assessment has become like the most fascinating thing in my life since working with the people at Haystack and digital media and learning, because it just seems like it all leads back there in some way or other. And it's very iterative, and if it hurts your brain a little bit, it's a sign, I think, that you're doing it right. It should feel a little bit harder than you initially thought. So it does. I don't see any more questions coming from people, and I know that quite a few people were just on an hour-long webinar prior to this. So I'm being mindful that people their brains might be saying, okay, we've got a lot of information to take back and start working with our teams on this. So so we may wrap this a little bit early, 6 minutes early, give people a chance to go and get back to their teams and get back to work. Unless anyone has a question or anything like that for Gurley. If you do have any questions about assessment, you have Kylie Larson's contact information in mine, and the LRNG team has been amazing at making their expertise available. So feel free to reach out to everybody, and if you have any questions, we're right here. This is going to be our last webinar of 2016, and I think we're going to be probably in touch with LRNG again in 2017. I think we're going to be working pretty closely with our partners. So thank you to everybody for joining us. And this is going to be recorded, or it has been recorded, will be archived. And Gurley, hopefully you'll share your slides as well for people that want to share it with their group. But thank you so much. Thank you to you and Kylie, and everybody. Have a wonderful week and holidays, and we'll be back in touch in the new year.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.